Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about an HOA that demands access to my shed to park tractor. I've always believed in the importance of respecting boundaries, both physical and personal, especially when it comes to private property. As a farmer, I've spent most of my life working with the land, growing crops, and caring for animals alongside my small but tight-knit family. My childhood taught me to appreciate hard work and mutual respect, values that have guided me for as long as I can remember. So, when our local homeowners association decided they wanted to commandeer my shed for their own purposes, without even giving me a chance to weigh in, it felt like a slap in the face. I suppose the incident, as I now call it, really started a few months ago, although the pieces had been lining up for quite some time. I'd inherited a spacious property from my grandfather, which encompassed a wide variety of fields, a stable area for my horses, a few barns, and a large tool shed behind my house. The tool shed in question isn't anything fancy. It's a sturdy wooden building with a corrugated metal roof that my grandfather built about 50 years ago. He kept it in good shape, and it's where I now store many of my personal farm implements: rakes, shovels, feed bins, and so on. I'm in a somewhat unique situation because part of my property falls under the watch of a local HOA. Our farm, initially just farmland, was subdivided a while back, leaving about 6 acres around the house within the boundaries of an official neighborhood that sprouted on an adjacent piece of land. The rest, which is the majority of my farmland, is separate from that HOA. My farmland has existed there for generations, whereas the neighborhood side is maybe a few decades old. This has caused friction in the past, but we always managed to keep things civil. My neighbors on the non-HOA side are friendly folks who've lived in the area for years, but some of the newer folks in that housing development have a decidedly different perspective on property lines and community than we do. I'd had plenty of minor disagreements with the HOA leadership before, mostly over small nonsense. They might claim that my fences didn't match the style of the rest of the neighborhood, or that the sign at my driveway was an eyesore. I usually talk to them politely, explained that my property is partially exempt from their more trivial guidelines, and things would quiet down for a few weeks. Sometimes they'd attempt to impose rules about the approved appearance of mailboxes, driveways, and so forth. I tried to stay on their good side, simply because I believed in being neighborly, but I always made it clear that I had legal documents exempting most of my farm buildings and farmland from HOA regulations. That's the background that sets up what happened next. The entire situation seemed strange from the start. One day, I got a knock on my door from Marcy, a high-ranking member of the HOA board, accompanied by a man I'd never met in my life. She introduced him as the boss of our board, though it was obvious that he was more than that. He was some kind of big-shot farmer, maybe from another county or somewhere else. Her eyes lit up like she was introducing an honored guest. She said his name was Trenton. He was a tall, broad-shouldered fellow with a big grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. I invited them in for a conversation, though I was a bit apprehensive. Right away, Marcy explained that they needed to borrow my shed. She stated it in a way that implied I should be happy to comply. She said they had a community event coming up, which required storing a tractor, Trenton's tractor. Her pitch was that since I'm a farmer, I would naturally understand how crucial it is to have safe, weatherproof storage for such an expensive piece of machinery. It seemed like an almost forced guilt trip. "You're a farmer too, so you must see that this is perfectly normal," she kept saying. I took a deep breath and calmly explained that my shed was filled with my personal equipment and that I used it nearly every day. We were in the middle of a busy season. I had to store seeds, fertilizers, animal feed, and repair equipment. My shed wasn't empty real estate for them to commandeer. The face that Trenton made at me was beyond condescending. He splayed his arms wide as if to say, "Come on, neighbor, show some solidarity." He started lecturing me about how community-minded farmers help each other out, and that in his hometown, farmers always shared storage spaces and equipment. He tossed out phrases like, "We all gotta stick together," or "neighbors helping neighbors." The irony of having never seen this man before, yet hearing him use neighbor so liberally, was not lost on me. Marcy chimed in that it would only be for a little while. When I asked how long a little while might be, she was vague. A few weeks, maybe a month, but it could be more. They just weren't sure yet. That set off alarm bells because they wanted me to displace all my own tools and supplies for an undefined period to accommodate someone else's tractor. Worse, They insisted that they needed 24/7 access to come and go, telling me that I couldn't lock the shed. If they needed to move the tractor at any time, they'd have to be able to get in. That was completely unacceptable to me. Why would I leave my entire shed unlocked? What if something of mine disappeared or got damaged? I politely but firmly said no. I tried to keep my tone even. I made it clear I empathized with the general desire to store a tractor, but it just wasn't feasible on my property. My farmland is not a communal storage yard, and the contents of the shed are essential to me. Marcy's face got tight. I could see the flush of annoyance creeping up her neck. Meanwhile, Trenton's grin vanished, replaced by a sour scowl. It was that moment when I realized that they had fully expected me to say yes without question. My refusal seemed to infuriate them. They didn't blow up at me right then, but they left quickly, with Marcy mumbling about how they'd have to find another solution. I felt uneasy as I watched them drive away. I'd had spats with the HOA before, but something about this one seemed different. They clearly had some personal investment in making sure Trenton was pleased. I suspected they might try some underhanded tactic, so I decided to keep an eye out for suspicious activity around my shed. Within the next few days, I started getting calls from neighbors, mostly curious or supportive. Some had heard rumors that I was refusing to help the community by not letting the HOA store essential equipment on my property. A few neighbors told me they'd been approached by Marcy or by other board members, asking them to talk to me. Supposedly, I was putting up a barrier to the success of some official farmland demonstration or educational event. The story they were spinning was that we, as a community, were going to invite local youth to learn about farming and needed a tractor. It was laughable because, as a full-time farmer, I would have been more than happy to teach kids about agriculture if asked. But no one had told me anything about that. Not a single mention of children's programs or educational visits had come from Marcy or Trenton. They'd only talked about needing a place to stash that tractor. The hypocrisy drove me up a wall. Then, about a week later, I woke up to find a new sign staked along the edge of my driveway. It read, in bold letters, "Community Project, coming soon." I had never heard a single word about a formal plan, so I dug a little deeper. It turned out that Marcy and a few other board members had unilaterally announced a tractor-based demonstration on the piece of land near our neighborhood's small lake. The sign implied that the show would be happening within the month and visitors would be shuttled from the neighborhood to see the tractor in action. Now, that might not sound like a direct problem for me, but the sign was definitely crossing onto my property line. My fence is located about 5 feet behind that stake. The sign was physically on my land. Besides, it all felt suspicious. Why was it near my driveway? I called Marcy and left a message, calmly requesting that the sign be removed and placed on HOA property instead. She never called back. Instead, a few days later, I found the sign had been repositioned, 2 feet closer to the road but still technically on my property. It wasn't a huge invasion, but it was petty. The message was clear. They were itching for a fight. They wanted to show me that they would push boundaries. I held off from calling a lawyer or contacting the authorities just yet, hoping we could settle this with a civilized conversation. Little did I know, that approach was too optimistic for the direction things were headed. Soon after, I heard from a friend down the street that the HOA board was holding a special meeting, presumably to discuss me. The meeting, I was told, was brimming with talk about how the farmer up the road was being uncooperative, was refusing to be a team player, and even ignoring the good of the community. Sure enough, I got an official letter from the board not long afterward. The letter hammered on about the necessity of storing the tractor for the educational demonstration. A newly invented reason, I was certain, and basically threatened that if I didn't comply, I could face fines or further legal action. They didn't specify how they could fine me since my portion of the property with the shed was never truly subject to their full authority, but they evidently hoped I was ignorant of that detail. It was borderline intimidation. At that point, I decided I needed to get my ducks in a row. I tracked down the relevant property deeds, covenants, and legal agreements that stated clearly that my farmland and the outbuildings were not under HOA jurisdiction. I spent a day rummaging through old filing cabinets, scanning documents, and verifying them with a friend who has some knowledge of property law. Sure enough, I was correct. The HOA had no authority to force me to store anything or grant them access to any outbuilding on my land. With that knowledge, I planned to respond promptly. But before I had the chance, the situation escalated dramatically, and in an unbelievably bizarre way. One sunny afternoon, I was at home repairing a broken fence post out front. Suddenly, a couple of police cruisers rolled up my driveway, lights flashing. My heart lurched. Naturally, I wondered if there'd been an accident or an emergency. The officers got out and approached me. One was a more experienced officer, eyes scanning the property. The other was younger, possibly a rookie. They asked if I was the property owner, and I said yes. Then they told me that they'd received a complaint from the HOA that I was illegally storing stolen equipment in my shed. I actually laughed out loud when they said it, but I tried to remain polite. They asked if I would consent to them taking a look inside the shed to ensure nothing was amiss. I'm not the type to challenge law enforcement without reason, but I asked politely what probable cause they had. They showed me the official complaint, which was basically a letter from the HOA's board stating that they believed I was concealing an unapproved tractor that belongs to the community. It was worded in a way that implied I might have effectively stolen or was refusing to return this tractor. I was flabbergasted. Not only did I not have their tractor, the very same tractor I'd refused to store in the first place, but I certainly wasn't hiding any community property. I invited the officers inside for a chat and provided them with my relevant legal documents. I calmly explained the entire fiasco, how the HOA demanded I store their tractor and that I had refused, how they threatened me with fines and legal action, and how they now had apparently called the police with a false accusation. The older officer seemed to quickly grasp the situation. He glanced over my documents, nodded occasionally, and quietly told me that it looked like I was in the clear. However, there was still the question of verifying that the tractor wasn't in my shed. I was a bit annoyed at the concept of letting them search without a warrant, but I was fairly confident that they were just responding to a complaint. I didn't want to cause a scene, especially since I had nothing to hide. So I agreed, as long as they'd note in their report that I was fully cooperative and that the complaint was evidently baseless. I walked them over to the shed. I opened the doors, revealing the usual chaos of my farm equipment. No tractor, obviously. The officers did a quick look, took note of my perfectly normal, legally owned supplies, and confirmed that the complaint was unfounded. By that point, Trenton and Marcy had driven onto my property. They'd arrived in a big SUV. I didn't see them approach at first, but I heard angry voices near the shed as the officers wrapped up. Marcy started ranting. "We know he's hiding it somewhere else on his land. Check the barn, too." She was pointing frantically toward one of my barns, where I keep my personal tractors, all of which are legally mine, that I use for my farmland. Trenton was pacing around, fuming, demanding that the police hold me accountable, as if it was a sure thing I had committed some crime. I'm a patient man, but that was the last straw. I told the police that I consented to no further searches beyond what we initially agreed upon. The older officer advised that Marcy and Trenton's suspicion alone wasn't enough to proceed. At that point, the two of them were basically shouting, claiming they had legal rights to check my entire property. I stepped up and told them, politely but firmly, that if they didn't leave my property immediately, I'd have them arrested for trespassing. The young officer looked decidedly uncomfortable, but took his cue from his partner, who was calm, professional, and evidently fed up with the nonsense. He told Marcy and Trenton that the matter was resolved, that the complaint was proven groundless, and that if they had further grievances, they could pursue them through the civil courts. Otherwise, they needed to leave. Marcy and Trenton started to argue that it was a community matter, but the officers were having none of it. They escorted both of them off my property. I watched with relief as the police vehicles departed, followed by that big SUV rolling away down my driveway. I couldn't help thinking, what on earth did they hope to accomplish by calling the police? Then it struck me. They probably thought they could create enough confusion or intimidation that I'd just back down and let them do what they wanted. It was a short-sighted, foolish tactic, and it blew up in their faces. That was the day I decided to put my foot down in a more official capacity. I contacted a lawyer friend in town, explained the situation, and we drafted a formal cease and desist letter aimed at the HOA board. It outlined that my property was off limits to them, that they had no right to store anything on it, and that if they or their associates tried to enter without permission again, they would face trespassing charges. We also demanded a public apology for the false accusation that resulted in a baseless police complaint. My attorney sent it to the HOA's official address and to their personal emails. I expected a fiery backlash, but what happened was more cunning. The HOA held another special meeting at which I heard Marcy passionately proclaim that they needed to be strong to preserve the community's best interests. They spun a new story, that I was being difficult out of greed or arrogance, that I was hoarding farmland, and that somehow I'd secretly promised them the use of my shed, but reneged. It was so outlandish. I couldn't believe adults were buying into it. I tried to defend myself by showing up to that meeting. My lawyer advised me that it might be good to appear publicly and present my side of the story. So, I walked into their meeting hall, a small building near the neighborhood's entrance, with a folder of documents under my arm. When I arrived, Trenton was up at the front speaking to about 24 HOA members, weaving a tale of how he'd planned a big educational program for kids. He described my refusal to store the tractor as a betrayal of rural values, painting me as an outlier in the farming community. I let him finish, then took the floor and calmly explained the entire timeline. How they demanded the shed with no advance notice, how I never agreed to store anything, how they threatened me, how they filed a false complaint with the police. I gave out copies of the relevant deeds that showed that my shed is not HOA property and they have no authority over it. Some people in the audience looked surprised. Others whispered among themselves. About halfway through my explanation, Marcy tried to cut me off, shouting that I was making up stories and that the truth would come out. That was the moment I pulled out a recording from my home security camera, taken on the day she and Trenton first demanded use of my shed. I had audio, not super clear but clear enough, of them pressing me. In the recording, you could hear me asking them for specifics on how long they'd need the shed and them refusing to provide details. That alone made it obvious that they never intended to be transparent. The crowd reaction was quite telling. Some of them were definitely no longer on the board's side. I could see it in their eyes. A few folks left the meeting shaking their heads. Still, the board tried to push forward with their narrative, but it was unraveling. Eventually, they had to adjourn the meeting because arguments were erupting left and right, with various members questioning Marcy's leadership and Trenton's real intentions. I left satisfied that at least the truth was out there in a public forum. I'd hoped that might be the end of it, but the next day I found fresh tire tracks near my shed. Someone had driven up to the building in the middle of the night. There were no new damages, but it was clear that the person had circled around the structure. I checked my security camera feed again, but the angle wasn't great, and I only caught fleeting glimpses of headlights. I had a sinking suspicion that Trenton or one of his allies might be up to something. Maybe scoping out whether they could store the tractor there by force, or they might have been looking for a place to stash it behind my back. Either way, it felt like harassment. I immediately called the police, filed a trespassing complaint, and handed them the security footage. An officer came out to survey the tracks, and while they couldn't confirm who it was, they took my complaint seriously given the context. Around that time, a smaller subplot emerged. My neighbor Andrew, who lives just on the other side of the property line, came by to warn me that the HOA had approached him about using his barn for tractor storage. Andrew's barn is older, somewhat rickety, and only partially enclosed. He turned them down right away, and apparently they gave him the same pitch about community spirit. Andrew told me he overheard them venting about me afterward, calling me stubborn and disloyal to the farming community. Andrew just laughed when he told me that. He's known me for years. He knows how ridiculous it is for someone to question my commitment to agriculture or to helping neighbors in genuine need. He was amazed by their nerve. It became evident that the HOA board was desperate to accommodate Trenton, who either was paying them off or was some sort of behind-the-scenes sponsor. I couldn't imagine why they'd go to such extremes otherwise. But ironically, their relentless push ended up galvanizing many residents against them. The false police report was a major turning point. Even some of the more docile neighbors, who typically went along with the board's decisions, felt that calling the police with false claims was a step too far. The public spectacle at the last meeting, where I played the recording, didn't help Marcy's credibility. Rumors began circulating that the board might face a motion to remove certain members from leadership. Things started to heat up legally as well. My cease and desist letter apparently alarmed some of the more cautious members of the board, because I heard that they'd told Marcy to back down. She refused, insisting that if they just kept the pressure on me, I'd fold and allow the tractor on my property. But with the property deed so clearly stating that the HOA has no control over my outbuildings, it was a losing battle. My lawyer had found an old section in the covenants that specifically explained that structures existing before the formation of the HOA were exempt from new rules, and my tool shed fell under that. Despite that, Trenton himself seemed determined to make an example of me. He didn't want to lose face. He even tried to approach me in person one day, driving up to my front gate, honking for me to come out, but I stayed inside. I refused to engage with him alone. I'd only talk to him with a witness present. Just when I thought I'd seen the worst of it, a bizarre situation arose. Late one night, a giant flatbed truck rumbled down my road. I was still awake, doing some paperwork in my office, and I saw headlights inching toward my place. It stopped right near my fence line. Through my office window, I could see them maneuvering for a while, then slowly leaving. The next morning, I found fresh tire ruts near the fence, as if they'd tried to back the flatbed onto my property. My guess is that maybe Trenton or whoever was driving tried to dump the tractor there, thinking if they put it on my land, I might be forced to store it. Talk about insane logic. I took more photos, called the police again, and once more filed a complaint. This repeated harassment gave my lawyer enough ammunition to escalate matters. She reached out to the county court, seeking a restraining order against specific board members, citing trespass, harassment, and the false police report they'd filed. That seemed to turn the tide. The mere mention of a potential restraining order caused an uproar within the HOA. Even those who'd been on the fence realized that if the court got involved, it would mean legal fees and a nasty public scandal. The last thing the typical homeowner wants is their HOA embroiled in a big legal fiasco that might cost them all money and raised fees. And the board's repeated lies weren't helping. Some local media channels began sniffing around after hearing rumors of a false police complaint and an attempted forced property takeover. Although it never became a major news piece, the threat of exposure made the board extremely uncomfortable. In that climate, a few brave souls on the HOA board decided they'd had enough of Marcy's leadership. They called for a vote of no confidence. Because I wasn't an official HOA member for that section of property, I didn't get to vote, but I certainly was rooting for them to do the right thing. My lawyer told me that such votes can be complicated, but apparently, they had enough support to hold a special session. Word on the street was that the session was a nightmare for Marcy. She tried to defend herself, saying she was acting for the good of the community, but her colleagues weren't buying it. They criticized her for forging ahead with this tractor scheme, apparently at Trenton's behest, and for calling the cops with a false accusation. They also pointed out that she had placed the HOA at risk of a lawsuit. In the end, the board voted to remove her from her position. Several other members who'd stood firmly by Marcy, including the treasurer, who helped file the false claims, were also pressured to step down. Trenton, no longer having an ally in the HOA leadership, was left out in the cold. Without the board's support, his entire plan to store the tractor, or to run some sort of event at the expense of my property, collapsed. I heard through the grapevine that he ended up hauling his tractor to a friend's farm a few counties over. He still tried to talk about the educational demonstration, but no one in the neighborhood was interested anymore. The fiasco had proven to them that it was all about him, not about educating kids. As for punishment, there wasn't a big dramatic arrest or anything, but the consequences were real enough. Marcy, having lost her position of authority, was humiliated in the community. People gossiped about how her petty vendetta had backfired so spectacularly. She also faced the possibility of personal liability in a potential slander or libel suit from me if I chose to pursue it. My lawyer and I considered it. But in the end, I decided that seeing her ousted was enough of a victory. The subsequent chatter around the neighborhood indicated she might move out once she found a buyer for her house, since she no longer felt welcome. I haven't seen her since the day she left the board meeting in tears. Meanwhile, the new HOA leadership reached out to me to apologize. They offered to pay any legal fees I had incurred as a peace gesture, which I appreciated. I told them that I hoped we could maintain a civil relationship from here on out. I don't have anything against a well-run homeowners association that respects the law and the rights of property owners, but I made it clear that my farmland is my livelihood, not a communal resource, and that if they ever want to organize a legitimate farming demonstration, they should talk to me first and do it respectfully. Interestingly, the fiasco ended up strengthening some bonds within my larger neighborhood. Neighbors who once just waved politely at me from their driveways now strike up conversations about the ordeal and how it exposed the flaws of that old regime. Some have asked if I'd be interested in teaching their kids a bit about raising goats or planting vegetables. So ironically, I might end up hosting a real educational program for local families, On my own terms, not at the demand of some pushy HOA boss. Looking back, I'm still in disbelief at how quickly it escalated. One minute I'm minding my own business, storing my tools in a shed, and the next minute I'm fending off a tractor invasion. The worst part was having the police show up on my land, suspecting me of theft. That was humiliating and infuriating all at once. But in the end, the truth came out. The rightful owners of that tractor never set foot in my shed, and the troublemakers got their comeuppance. Their biggest mistake was underestimating how committed I am to defending what's mine, especially the legacy I inherited from my grandfather. My property is not just a piece of land. It's a representation of my family's history, our effort, and the many years we've poured into maintaining it. Nowadays, I keep my shed securely locked with a well-placed security camera pointing right at it. I also have posted clear, no trespassing signs, so there can be no confusion about whether someone is allowed near the building. Since Marcy and her group are gone, the new HOA has made no attempts to cross the line. In fact, they've been downright cordial. They invited me to a neighborhood barbecue last month, and I attended, not to brag or rub it in, but to show that I'm willing to move past the drama and be a good neighbor to anyone who treats me with respect. I enjoyed a pleasant afternoon, had some good food, answered a few curious questions about goats and crop rotation, and left feeling optimistic that perhaps we could find a harmonious balance after all. In my view, the story's moral is straightforward. You can't bully or strong-arm someone into giving up their rights, their land, or their property, especially not under the guise of community needs, if it's really just personal gain. The entire affair taught me a lot about standing my ground. I think, in a strange way, it also taught the rest of the neighborhood about just how important it is to ensure their HOA is run by people who respect boundaries and abide by the law. In conclusion, I never did grant them access to my shed, and I'm proud of it. I still grow my crops, raise my animals, and use my land as I see fit. If anyone genuinely needs help, I'm the first to volunteer. But if they want to come onto my property by deception or force, they can expect me to push back. The image of Marcy and Trenton's faces when the police sided with me is something I'll never forget. That moment was the turning point. The instant they realized calling the authorities was a colossal mistake. And I must confess, it felt pretty good to watch their entire scheme unravel. Friends, thank you. See you soon.